We are facing a serious crisis when it comes to having teachers in the profession. So when I see folks in this work, my heart is warm because it's not easy work. And this year is taking on special significance for me because my son is about to start his first year as a classroom teacher, teaching 7th graders in Houston, Texas. I keep telling him he doesn't know what he's getting into, right? But he says he's ready, but you know, we all been there. Where are my teacher candidates? Raise your hands again, my teacher candidates. We should take pictures of these folks right now, Dr. Nix. Take pictures of them right now, because when I started teaching, I had a lot of hair, right? And you see what happened to me, because this work is difficult, it's demanding, it's intense, but it is important. And so what I want to do with you today is spend some time talking to you about just some of the work that I've been doing, but I think it has lots of ramifications for everyone in this room. I know I've got pre-service teachers or teacher candidates, I've got in-service folks, I've got school leaders, we've got teachers, so we've had the full gamut. And I think this is the way we learn, this is the way we all get better, and most importantly, this is how we better serve our students. I love your theme about putting families first. I think we have to think in those terms because we're not just servicing students, we are servicing families. And I oftentimes say that, I frequently have to pinch myself because I think, how is it that I am up here able to do what I do, having the honor to talk with educators? And because in so many ways, this story really should not have happened. And I tell people this frequently. When I do this work that I do, and this comes from years of being in the classroom, then going into higher education, I can speak really pointedly about what education has done for my life. Because in so many ways, I should not be here. And so that's why when I talk about this topic, it's very emotional for me. I get passionate because I know how my life could have been and should have been, by some accounts, very different than what it is now. Having grown up where I grew up in Compton, California, where young black boys oftentimes don't graduate from high school, let alone going to college. But I am here and I do this work, and I'm fortunate because I stand on the shoulders of a lot of women and men who saw something in me that I did not see in myself. I started at home with a mother and father who kept pushing me at every turn, at every corner. And part of what I want to impress upon everyone in this room is that you just never know who you have in your classrooms. You never know who you have in your schools. And oftentimes we have young people who are just needing someone to believe in them. And I was fortunate enough to have enough people who believed in me that I finally started to believe in myself. And that cannot happen without having someone who sets that foundation for you. I oftentimes say that we are the product of other people's expectations. I'll say that again. We are the products of other people's expectations. At the end of the day, we will all live up or live down to what people expect of us. Everyone in this room is here because someone, somewhere, believed that you would be here. It's not accident, it's not coincidental, it's not happenstance. And so we have got to have that same kind of set of expectations for our students that others have had for us. That makes sense to folks? Okay, so I'm not going to preach, I'm going to talk now, okay? So let me kind of get into it, all right? So I want to sort of talk about issues around race, culture, and trauma. Much of my work has been really around race and culture, and I'm going to talk about that, but over the last 2 years, I've been doing more observations, and I spent lots of time in classrooms, and part of what was becoming clear to me is that there was something else happening with students that I don't think we were talking about, and that's this issue of trauma. And I worked with pre-service candidates, and I would spend time in their classrooms, and I was seeing behavior of students that just defied typical behavior, and I felt like we were not having conversations about it. So one of the things I've been doing of late is having conversations with educators across the board, and one of the fundamental questions I ask them frequently is, what is it that explains why some students succeed and why others do not? That's one of our fundamental questions we're all trying to figure out. I mean, you all are in schools. You see some students who have all the risk factors that seemingly would suggest that they would not do well, but somehow they do well. On the flip side, you see a number of students who seem to have all the supports in place that would suggest that they would do well, and they don't do well, right? And then there are those who have the risk factors and they don't do well, and then you have some who don't have the risk factors and they do well. So the question becomes very clear about why it is that some students do well and others don't. But what has been disturbing to me as I ask this question, we're collecting surveys with like hundreds and hundreds of teachers, is that as I ask this question, part of what I get from many educators is that one of the reasons, or among the primary reasons that students don't do well, is that it typically falls into where their homes aren't, stable, parents don't care, students are unmotivated. So it's all these kinds of responses, right? And those responses, while I think they have some merit, I don't think they fully explain the situation, right? And what has really given me some pause of late is there's been this big focus on grit, right? And I got into a big debate with this lady, Angela Duckworth, because part of what she says in the book that's like a big national bestseller is that, what we need to do is teach kids grit, right? They need to learn how to work hard. They need to learn how to not give up. They need to learn how to be resilient. They need to learn how to just keep trying hard. And part of that, and part of why we had this debate, some might have called it an argument, is because to me that implies that certain kids don't already have resilience, that they don't already show persistence, that they don't demonstrate hard work. I mean, because they're not doing well in school does not suggest that they don't have grit. And part of her argument was, no, we have to teach them grit because if they had grit, they would do better. And I just think that's a simplistic argument. I think it's not really deep-seated in a more nuanced set of factors. And I guess I was taking it personal because of these kids that she's talking about, that fit me. That described my neighborhood. That described, my family. That described lots of people in my neighborhood and lots of neighborhoods all across this country where we oftentimes are really quick to say as a default, these kids just don't do well because they just don't want it bad enough. They just don't try hard enough. They just don't really sort of discipline themselves, right? And so part of what we see as we ask these teachers these questions, that more of this is being given as to why some students don't do well, right? They need to learn how to be flexible. They need to learn how to not give up. They need to learn how to just keep persevering. And I don't want to discount any of those factors because they do matter and they are important. But for me, the argument is centered in the fact that they're not already doing these things, right? And now there's a big industry of works that are all centered around this idea that, how children succeed, how to raise kids with grit. And then, like I mentioned, Duckworth's book, which it's like almost like the education Bible now, or the education Quran. If you read this book and if you hit your kids over the head with it and teach them how to be gritty, they'll be fine. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it, okay? I'm just not fully on board with the whole grit piece because part of what we're doing, and part of what I want my candidates here to understand, is that part of what we're asking kids to do is to change their effort. But what we are not doing is we're not seeking to change the situation around them. And I think that's an unfair thing to do, right? We want young people to do some things different, but we don't change all the social toxins around them that oftentimes result in why they do what they do. And part of what we have to do, if we're going to have a fair argument, if we're going to have a balanced debate, if we're going to have a full-on discussion, if we're going to be intellectually honest, I want us to be mindful of the circumstances that our children are manifesting their brilliance in every single day. And yes, I said brilliance because we don't talk about that enough, right? See, part of what I think Duckworth misses is that every single day we've got young people and their families who are doing the unthinkable, who are demonstrating unbelievable grit, right? You show me a single parent who's working on minimum wage, who takes care of 3 children on her own, and every day those kids are fed and they're clothed and they come to school on time and never miss a day. That is grit. You show me the parent who has not only her children, but 2 of her nieces or nephews, right? Who works 2 jobs, part-time, 1 job, full-time, works 12, 14, 15 hours a day. That is grit, right? You show me kids who deal with some of the most unthinkable set of circumstances, but they still show up every day at school to be the best they can be. That is grit. And that's the part I think she misses in this argument. So part of what we have to do is begin to look at this situation that our kids are in. And I think part of what we do, if we know better, I would hope that we would what? Do better. And so part of what I do, I have a group of PhD students, and we do these analysis of different districts and different cities and different counties across the nation, just so we can make this a very complete discussion if we're going to talk about grit, right? So part of what we do is we create these snapshots of classrooms. And I made a snapshot of classrooms here in the greater Milwaukee area, right? Because I want to make this more specific. Got you, Dr. Nix, I got you. I'm looking out for you, right? And so what we do, I have this group of doctoral students, we take these data, they crunch numbers, and we look on all these different websites, and we take, again, the data we have is like 2015, 16, so some of this might be slightly off. But I think by our count, we show that Milwaukee has about 77,000 students. And so what we do is we take those numbers and we crunch them and we make an imaginary class of 30 with the ratios and proportions being the same. Now, some of these numbers might differ based on where you are in within the greater Milwaukee area or even across the state, but it gives you a snapshot of the situation that our kids are in that I think we have to be mindful of if we're going to have a real honest conversation about why some students succeed and why some don't. So part of what we find in this classroom is that 20 out of the 30 students in Milwaukee will live in poverty. Now, some of you are probably in schools that number is probably what? 30 out of 30, right? But this is what we get across the area. So 20 out of 30. I maintain that poverty, perhaps more than any other thing, is one of the biggest challenges to helping young people succeed. And Duckworth doesn't take into consideration the role that poverty has on performance. Poverty is a big, big challenge, a huge obstacle of why some students cannot succeed because issues around resources and support are real and we can't dismiss those, we can't deny those. But part of what I will say to everyone in this room, especially to my candidates who are about to embark upon this work, while poverty does pose a significant challenge in helping students be successful, by no means does it mean that children cannot be successful because they grow up poor. I will go one step further. If anybody in this room, anybody, I don't care if you're just about to start teaching, you've been teaching 100 years, if you believe that poor kids cannot learn, you should not be in this work. As a matter of fact, we can pause and we can help you pack up and we can walk you to your car. We can do whatever we've got to do, but if you don't believe that poor people can be successful, you should not be doing this work. I mean, I say that with every ounce of my being and every sort of ounce of my fiber because far too often I hear educators, folks who are supposed to be in this work because they believe that all kids can be successful, but they'll tell me all these things that poor children cannot do. And my thing is, part of what you don't recognize that poor kids have unbelievable intellect that we oftentimes don't capture and measure because poor kids have to learn how to do what every single day? Survive, right? I always say we should give a test on how to get by on $10 a week and see who would do well on that test, right? I keep saying that what we don't realize is that poor kids have a sixth sense that we don't quite capture because they figure things out that most kids who have far more cannot ever understand. You know, I always make this joke. My wife and I, we have 4 kids. Love them deeply, love them dearly. They're all amazing kids. They're spoiled rotten. I guess I take some credit for that. But my kids have a very different upbringing than my wife and I had. I grew up in Compton. My wife grew up in South Central LA. We used to have this running joke. And the running joke was, why don't we take the kids one day and I'll drop 2 of them off in Compton. You drop 2 of them off in South Central LA. Let's tell them to get home the best way they know how, right? She was like, don't do that to my babies. They may not come home, right? The goal being that they have a very different upbringing than we had, and they have tons of book sense and book smart, but what they lack is what? Common sense, street sense, right? Basic stuff that we see these kids manifest every single day. So I need you to understand that kids who come from low background have tremendous potential, tremendous promise, tremendous intellect, and they manifest it every single day. Oftentimes, we just don't pick up on it, okay? So let's go one step further in our imaginary class. We also know that of those 20 students that you have in your classroom that are poor, that could be higher, 2 live in what's considered extreme poverty. And many of you are in these schools where you already see this. What is extreme poverty? A family of 4 or more on an income of $10,000 or less. Okay, I'm not good at math, but $10,000 a year is how much a month? She said less than 1,000. That's my kind of math, right? Okay, yeah. It's less than $1,000 a month, right? Less than $1,000 a month. Okay, what are average rents here in 700? Okay, so let's pay, she's shaking her like, where are you living for $700 a month, right? But let's just go with $7 a month. So if I make less than $1,000 a month, actually this number is about 8 something a month. Thank you, sir. There you go. $833, that's my kind of math right there. So $833, if I pay my rent after $700 a pay, what do I have left? $133, right? And I haven't gotten to food, I've not gotten to utilities, I haven't gotten to transportation, I haven't gotten to daycare, I haven't gotten to anything. So part of what we have to recognize is that you have families who are living what's considered extreme poverty. And part of what you need to understand is that oftentimes students show up in your classrooms without having had food to eat that night or in some cases that morning. So I'm glad to hear that many of your schools, hopefully all your schools, have breakfast programs in them. You have students who oftentimes show up in your classrooms having very difficult nights before because of a host of circumstances beyond their control. But they still show up. That's the grit that Duckworth does not talk about. So I need you to understand extreme poverty is that oftentimes you have children who don't know where the next meal is coming from, where they're going to sleep that night, and that's part of their reality, part of their circumstances. Again, we can't ask them to change their effort, but not change the circumstances around them. Part of what we know is that of these 20 kids who live in poverty, and this is important for us to keep in mind, 8 of the students who live in poverty have full-time working parents. Because see, there's this narrative out there that says that poor kids, poor families are poor because they want to be poor. Now, I don't know where that narrative comes from. Who wants to be poor? Part of what we have to recognize, and Gene Anion talked about this, is that we have what's called the working poor. We have folks who work full-time jobs who still fall below the poverty line. So this idea that folks who are poor, who live in low-income circumstances, don't want to improve their lot, that's just not true for a lot of families, right? You can work, what's the minimum wage here in Wisconsin? Yeah, $7.75, so you can do the math. $7.75 times, 40 hours a week is not going to get you above the poverty line. So it's not uncommon to see families who are working every day, all day, but still having a difficult time making ends meet. You've got to understand that. So we cannot just write these folks off to say they just don't want something better. Folks are trying as hard as they can. Some of the children that you teach and that you serve have families where a mother is working not just one job, but sometimes 2 jobs. A mother and a father sometimes working multiple jobs, but still in this sort of rat race not getting ahead. You've got to have some empathy to understand what that must feel like, okay? Let's stay in our classroom. We also know 5 of the 30 students will not speak English as their primary language. How many of us are seeing the number of ELs on the rise here, right? And look, that number, folks, is not going to decrease. That number is only going to what? Increase. I'm in Southern California where we've seen these numbers go up dramatically, the number of ELs. And we have this big narrative around ELs, that somehow they're just not as capable as students who speak English as their first language. I hate to disappoint folks, that is not true. There's all kinds of work in the field of linguistics and cognitive science that say that if you speak multiple languages, unlike myself, if you speak multiple languages, that gives you a certain degree of cognitive dexterity, which means that that is a gift and a talent. It is not a detriment. So how do we take language learners who are some of our brightest and gifted and most talented students in our classrooms, and we just set them in the corner to teach them? That is educational neglect, folks, plain and simple. Cannot do it. Our language learners need to be recognized for the talent and for the intellect they have because they speak multiple languages. Some of these young children are serving as the go-to between their homes and their schools. They open up the mail, they help pay the bills, they help communicate with the outside world with their families. That is a strength. Some of us are grown with education, we still can't manage our households. Yeah, we got 8- and 9-year-olds who are doing that for their families. Understand the intellect, that is grit. And then what we do in Southern California, which deeply disturbs me, and I hope you don't do it here in Wisconsin, we have students who don't speak English as their first language. We ended our bilingual education program about 15 years ago. We don't want kids to speak any language other than English. We take away the language. But then we say, oh, by the way, if you want to go to college in the next 10 years, guess what you need to have when you get to high school? Why not just keep the first language in place and continue to build on it as you go? But I think we oftentimes play the language police in ways that we say that we have to replace one with the other. It should not be either or, it should be both and. Okay, so hopefully you have policies in place that do that. Let's stay in our classroom. How about 6 of the 30 students would not be reared by their biological parents? Some of you, I'm sure, are seeing this. They're being reared by their family members, grandparents, foster parents. I was in Chicago just last year. I will never forget this woman. She was 96 years old, raising her great-great-great-grandchildren, right? Understand the situation, understand the circumstances, right? Who is raising our children is so important. That's why I love this Families First thing, because it's recognized it's not just the student. Understand the entire context. My beginning teachers, one of the most important things you can do is get out and talk to families, learn about their situations, understand their plight, try to learn as much as you can about what they do on a day-to-day basis to try to provide for their families. Oftentimes we write them off. We've got to get families involved. If families are not involved, we're never going to maximize the outcomes of our students, okay? So understand this. We also know that 2 of your 30 students will be homeless. I'm just curious of my current teachers. Show of hands, how many folks have had homeless students in their classrooms? Look around, almost every hand is going up of folks who've been in this work. So my candidates need to understand you're gonna have students who show up in your classrooms who did not sleep in a nice, warm, comfortable bed before. We have students who are living in shelters, in cars, on the streets. This is just the reality, unfortunately, right? So you can't tell these students, I need you to go home and find a quiet, well-lit place and do your homework for 2 hours, because they'll look at you like, you don't know what my situation looks like. You'll see students who are at school who oftentimes, I remember when I taught for years, I always had students who would hoard at lunch. Can I have your apple? Can I have your banana? Can I have your milk? Because what are they thinking about? Home. I mean, I need to eat now, but I also have to think about where my next meal is coming from 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 hours from now. Understand that we all had Psychology 101, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What did Maslow tell us? If our most basic of needs were not met, food, safety, shelter, that as much as you can try to test and test and test, it's not going to make a difference, folks. I maintain that one of the reasons why so many of our beginning teachers leave is because they don't get this stuff right here. They don't understand. It's not about the content. It's about how do you connect and understand students' realities, okay? And then the other part of this work that we don't talk about in this imaginary classroom, and this was hard to find, but we got data from your district. 7 out of the 30 students will be victims of some type of physical, sexual, verbal, or emotional abuse before turning 18. And when we collect this data, what we oftentimes hear from CPS, Children Protective Services, is that for every one case that we know about, there's probably another case that we should know about, but it has not been reported just yet. So when you do the math on that, if we know about 7 out of your 30 students, the reality is it may be close to what? 14, which is essentially what? Half. Let me ask again, show of hands, how many of my current teachers have had students that they have known or suspected was a victim of some type of abuse? Look around, folks. This stuff is real. You can't make this stuff up. You know, part of what we have to recognize, as hard as it is and as difficult as it is and as challenging as it is, there are students who show up in our classrooms and in our schools who are dealing with some of the most horrific circumstances that no child should have to deal with. No child, right? My wife is a children's social worker. She's been doing this work for 20 years, and she brings these cases home. And sometimes I just can't even stomach to hear them because they're just so difficult to think that children have to live with these circumstances. She had a case earlier this year, 11-year-old girl, lives with her 2 younger siblings and mom's a single parent, raising the 3 kids. Mom meets the boyfriend. Boyfriend moves in to help take care of the kids. All right, you all know where this story's going, unfortunately. The boyfriend begins to sexually molest the 11-year-old girl, says if she says anything about this to anybody, her mom or her siblings, that he'll hurt them, hurt her mom. So for close to a year, this 11-year-old girl still showing up at school dealing with something that no child should have to deal with, right? The young 11-year-old girl finally musters up the courage to tell her mom what the boyfriend has been doing. And you know the outcome here, right? Mom doesn't believe her. Says she's trying to come between her and the boyfriend. So then she puts her out of the house because she's lying on the boyfriend. So now you have a girl who's not only a victim of abuse, she's also what? Homeless, right? We have these children who show up every day in your classrooms, and if you took the time out to listen to their stories, you would understand what they're going through. There's one thing I want my teacher candidates to understand about this work. There's one thing that you take away from my brief time with you this morning. Relationships, they matter, okay? Relationships would allow you to begin to talk to students to understand their circumstances and understand what they go through on a day in, day out basis. We have children who are walking around in some severe pain, right? Dealing with circumstances that no child should have to deal with. You will have children who show up 95-degree weather with long sleeve shirts on and a coat on because they don't want you to see the bruises that they may have on their arms. You have children who show up with big bruises and big cuts on them. You ask them what happened. They give you 3 different stories or 3 different accounts of what happens. You'll tell students, you know what, if I don't get you to do X, Y, or Z, I'm going to call home. And they beg and plead for you not to call home because they know what that may result in. You've got kids who live in situations and circumstances, unfortunately, where parents and caregivers are engaging in abuse of all kind of different substances, which leads to all kind of neglect. That should not have to be what students deal with, but they are dealing with it. It cuts across all different ethnicities, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, American, Latino. It cuts across all socioeconomic. This is not something that only happens in poor homes. It happens in middle-class homes. It happens in affluent homes. I want us to stop using this language about what happens in quote-unquote broken homes. I don't know what a broken home is. Oftentimes, the euphemism for broken home is single-parent household. Well, let me tell you something, folks. I've seen some two-parent households that don't look like they're quite together. That I think they could qualify as being broken, right? So understand that these issues are going on in our schools, and your children are facing these every single day. So if you deal with one of these factors, it makes it difficult. But some of your students are dealing with 4 or 5 of these factors, but they still show up. Tell me that is not grit. Tell me that is not resilience. Tell me that's not determination. Understand the circumstances, because what we have essentially, and this is what the new work I've been doing centers around, is we have trauma. Lots of trauma that goes untreated, undiagnosed. We need to have a conversation in this country about mental health. We are very much taboo around mental health by and large. We want to act like it doesn't exist, but I'm willing to bet that you cannot go around this room and have one person that tell you somebody in their families who has not been affected by issues tied to mental health. Trauma is mental health, folks, and what we know, and we're learning more and more about it, it affects you physically, behaviorally, folks. That's what we see with a lot of our children in our classrooms. The behavior is not bad behavior. The behavior is oftentimes a plea or a cry for help, right? But what we tend to do is we see that plea or we hear that cry for help and we say, we want you out of our classroom. We want you out of our school. So the very thing we ought not be doing when a child is asking for help in his or her own unique way is putting that out. We should be bringing them closer to us and say, we need to help you. We need to understand what is going on that is explaining why you're exhibiting the behavior that you're exhibiting, right? Look, it influences the ability to learn. There's all kind of research that says that children who are under complex trauma have their cognitive development severely compromised. Behavior is oftentimes challenged. The ability to cultivate relationships sometimes is compromised because, again, oftentimes children who are in trauma are not likely to trust adults. Why? Because adults have not oftentimes always done well by them. So understand trauma. Also, you have to understand the different types of trauma, okay? Some of it is single incident trauma. Too many of our children, you talk to them, they've lost a loved one. They've lost a mother, a father, a brother, a friend. No one talks about it. No one says, do you need help? No one says, how are you feeling? So sometimes it's a single incident of trauma that sends a child completely off the tracks, and that child can never recover. Some of us in this room have had single incidents of trauma that we're still trying to make sense out of, right? You also have complex or repetitive trauma that happens on an ongoing basis, like the little girl I described to you where she was being molested on a regular basis. Some of you know this. My educators who are seasoned understand this. When I used to teach, I would always be intrigued by the fact that school would let out at 2:30. And sometimes I stayed as late as 4:30, 5 o'clock, and there would still be students on that playground, right? Why would that happen oftentimes? Because for some of our students, guess what? School is the only safe haven that they have. Your classroom is the only safe haven that they have. They don't want to go home in some cases because of the circumstances that they might have to deal with. Understand what that means. Then we also have developmental trauma. For some of our students who've been exposed to this from a very early age in their life. For some of our students, I hate to say this, folks, and we just have to start talking about this. For some of our students, trauma has been normalized. That's all they know, right? One of the things we deal with in schools, I'm seeing more and more, is just fighting over little things. Why do people fight? Because oftentimes that's what they see other people do around them. We don't solve conflicts through our words. They say, I don't like you, you don't like me, you step in my shoes, so guess what I do? I fight you, plain and simple. So we have to understand that this developmental trauma oftentimes happens early and it becomes normalized, and we have to help sort of reprogram how kids think about this. And I don't want you to walk away from this time here thinking that these are all deficits. These are not. We're having to talk about the realities that many of our children are facing, okay? And then we also have what's referred to as intergenerational trauma that we're studying, right? How many times, I'm talking to my seasoned educators, do you look at a child and say, why does that child behave the way that child behaves? And then mom shows up, right? And it answers all your questions about why the child behaves the way that she behaves, right? Because some of this stuff is passed on from one generation to the next, right? Sometimes we got 3, 4, 5 generations of trauma. that has never been addressed, never been disrupted, never been analyzed, never been given any kind of help or assistance. We have to understand this stuff because this is impacting our ability to help our kids be successful academically. Part of what pains me is that we talk about wanting to see educational outcomes change, academic outcomes improve. I hate to be the bearer of bad news again, but look, folks, I'm just being a realist now because I spend too much time in school. We're not going to see any real academic turnaround until we start dealing with this stuff right here. It is just that potent. It is that impactful. And part of what frustrates me is I walk into schools, all kinds of trauma. I say, how many social workers do you have at the school? Well, we split one social worker with 5 different schools. We get the social worker for half a day every Monday. That's not going to get it. How many mental health therapists do you have in your school? Well, we get her once every other month. How's that going to work? Part of what we have to recognize is that we are just kind of the hamster in the wheel, putting a whole lot of effort into something that's not getting us far until we have this ongoing conversation about the way that trauma is real and it's impacting us in a real major way. So we need to understand this is an ethical imperative. It has national consequences because why almost 50% of children have experienced at least one or more kind of trauma. That's half, right? You go one step further, 26%, 1 in 4 will experience some kind of traumatic event by the age of 4. For some of our children, when they first get to kindergarten, they've already been experiencing trauma, right? We need to understand this. So there's a reason why we can't get 4-year-old, 5-year-old kids to sit down and participate because some of the stuff our 4- and 5-year-old kids have seen and experienced and been through is heavy, folks. There was a study that was done where in the district that I work closest with in Los Angeles, the LA Unified School District, they found that 98% of their 6th graders had experienced some type of traumatic event in the past year. Violence, neglect, poverty, witnessing it, seeing it, death, separation from parents, incarcerated parents, foster youth, right? The list goes. When you start adding all these things that are part of some of the students' lives that we serve, understand the trauma associated with it. And we're seeing that a lot of kids are exhibiting behavior that's really in line with post-traumatic stress syndrome. Think about that for a second, folks. I mean, you all, some of my teachers here know you have some students, you have to monitor them every minute by the minute, right? You have some students who just for them to sit still for more than 5 minutes without doing any damage, that is a win, right? So we have to talk about this, and part of what I hope we don't do, when I used to teach in Compton, we used to do this thing that I just thought was a norm, but it was not good. We would have this every year, so I taught 1st, 3rd, and 5th grade. We would sit down at the end of the year, and I know I've got some principals here. I hope principals are not doing this. We would sit down, the 3rd grade teachers would sit with the 4th grade teachers, and we plan the classes for the next year, right? And when we do that, it would almost feel like a draft, right? So we would bargain and like we would like trade, okay, I'll give you these 3 kids if you take this one. Like, let me think about that. No, that's not a good deal. And then so give me something. We go back and forth trying to mix and match the class for the next year. I see folks shaking their head. It sounds familiar, right? And so sometimes the stakes got kind of high because there was always a couple kids that nobody wanted, and we would try to barter. Like, okay, you know what? I'll give you access to the coffee maker. I'll give you the preferred parking spot. I'll give you 5 gift cards to Starbucks if you take this kid. Nah, still not good enough a deal, right? So we would kind of go back and forth, right? So what would happen every single year I taught, can't make this stuff up. We'd have a group of kids that we could never decide upon where they were going to go. I called them the free agents. So we'd have about 6 or 7 kids that no teacher would agree to take for the next year. As much as we would go back and forth, bartering, trying to exchange, but we couldn't figure it out. So we'd have these 6 kids, and the principal would just say, okay, let's just kind of figure that out later. So these 6 kids would be left, unclaimed. And so you know what would happen with those 6 kids the next year? They would be the start of a new class. And who would get that new class? The new teacher, right? The new teacher. So one of these students is difficult to deal with, let alone to have 6 of them. So my candidates, I hate to say this, but you're getting set up in some ways, right? Because you're oftentimes being given the most challenging students to teach. And I don't know why we do this to beginning teachers, right? Say, right, exactly. Why do we do this? We should be taking our most seasoned, our most effective teachers to teach our most challenging students, right? We take the most challenging student, we put them with the most inexperienced, the most underqualified folks, and then we wonder why it's not working, right? That's why we have now data looking at the fact that we have teachers who are experiencing secondary traumatic stress. I'm going to say that again. Teachers who are experiencing secondary traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, right, insomnia, have all the signs and don't even realize that when you are in close access or close proximity to folks who are in trauma, you start taking on some of that trauma and you don't even know it. Now I just gave you a name for why you feel tired and it's still August. You haven't even started teaching yet, right? So understand this. So part of what I need you also to understand is that everyone should know about the ACEs, right? The Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. This is important. This is powerful for all of us to understand, right? This is toxic stress or childhood trauma that children deal with. And this study came out, I forgot when it came out, 12, 13 years ago. They looked at the prevalence of trauma. And it talked about the things that kids have been exposed to. And you can go online and you can do this score. I even have some students complete the ACEs instrument because it tells you what you're dealing with, right? Ask questions like, have you been exposed to violence? Have you been a victim of violence, et cetera, right? But when they came up with the ACEs scores, part of what they didn't realize is that they did this in a predominantly middle-class neighborhood, this instrument. The data did not quite reflect what was in urban communities. So now, about 7, 8 years ago, they had the urban ACEs, which is a different but similar kind of instrument that begins to look at things such as emotional, physical abuse, physical neglect, but it also goes into these urban ACE indicators, like whether or not students have witnessed violence, which we know a lot of our kids unfortunately have, whether or not they've ever felt discrimination, which we unfortunately know that many of them have, whether or not they have oftentimes felt unsafe in their neighborhoods, which again, we know many of our kids have. So when you look at these urban ACE indicators, that's why we see the numbers being significantly higher, because there's some risk factors in certain neighborhoods and communities that we don't take into consideration. Experiencing bullying. We need to have a whole conversation about bullying. Bullying is taking on a whole new dimension now. And part of the research that my colleague, Rich Milner, has been doing at the University of Pittsburgh is looking at bullying, and the bullying dynamic is changing now, because what some of their data is showing is that bullying is now overwhelmingly girl on girl, right? And some of my educators here can probably attest to that, right? And part of what we know is not only is it more girl on girl, but that it looks different. So with boys, when boys have an issue, if I come and I hit you, you hit me, and 5 minutes later, guess what? It's done. Matter of fact, I probably have more respect for you now because I didn't think you could hit that hard, right? So we're good. Boys are good 5 minutes later. And I'm speaking generally, of course, right? But with girls, it tends to be less physical and more what? Emotional, right? And with cyberbullying, it takes on a whole new dimension, right? I can say something nasty about you and send it to 50 people with the click of a button, and this stuff lingers and lingers and lingers and lingers, and when kids feel unsafe, they can't learn. This is trauma because they're talking about me. They don't want me around them. They exclude me from the group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to understand these urban ACEs. Also, I want you to understand, this is all about toxic stress, right? Now there's this big body of research that educators need to be reading that's coming from the field of cognitive science that says that, look, kids who are dealing with trauma are under intense toxic stress, which means that their cognitive capacities are being compromised. What does that mean? That neurons are not connecting and not firing off in the ways that they should. So we have neurons in our cerebellum which says that, guess what? If something happens to me, I have the ability to stop, reflect, and think about what I'm going to do or say before I do it or say it. If those neurons are compromised, I don't have that ability to stop and reflect oftentimes. I do just the opposite. I just what? I respond first and then I think second, right? You see this in your schools. Kids act first and then think second. It's oftentimes because cognitively they're not in a space to do that. How many times have you asked a student, why did you do what you did? And the student says, I don't know. And you know why they don't know? Because they don't know oftentimes. I'm saying we have to understand how the brain works and how it's having a big impact on what we're seeing in our schools, okay? Now, let me kind of move one step further. What I need you to understand is that we have children who are walking around. This is a picture that a 10-year-old girl who's in 5th grade at the school we work at, she said, I am just broken and I'm trying my best to keep it together. I'm trying, but she said, if you just knew just the pain and the hurt and the fear and the frustration I have every single day. This is why I need my teacher candidates to just build those relationships, to talk to students. Sometimes you might be the lone person who just gives a 2 cents about a student, right? Bring that student into your classroom. I know principals who bring him or her into your office and just let them know that there's at least one person who cares, right? There's one person who will listen. There's one person who will say you matter. There's one person who will say you're important. There's one person who will say you'll overcome that, right? I know we're all busy, but sometimes we have kids who are on the brink of just breaking down because what they're dealing with, no child should have to deal with. Many of us as adults would not be able to deal with some of these issues. And so that's why I need you to begin to think about this as not just hard work, but heart work. How do we understand that if I were in that child's shoes, would I want someone to reach out to me, okay? So I also want you to understand that race plays a role in this as well, because there's a trauma of racism, because sometimes we engage in some kinds of behaviors in schools that only perpetuate the trauma. Okay, what do I mean by that? Oftentimes, we have these narratives about certain populations. We see this happening in Los Angeles right now with our Latino population, because everybody's assumed that they are somehow undocumented. So when you have someone constantly assuming that you are a problem, you come from a family of criminals, we need to seek to deport you, yet you've got 5, 6 generations of folks who are born in this country. But you're still given that label. That's trauma, right? Children observing the language that we use around certain racial groups, trauma, right? Even peers engaging in hurtful race talk is trauma. We need to start having these conversations about race, folks, because they are real and they matter to our students, yet we still act as if they're not. Stereotype threat. Kids are walking around thinking that because I'm black or brown, the narrative says that I'm not supposed to do well, so therefore let me act as if I'm not going to fulfill that stereotype. That compromises cognitive load, right? You know, Steele has written about this extensively. The wider discourse about a particular group is all part of this as well. And here's where it plays out the most, and I want you all to start thinking about this, is racial microaggression. Because I have teachers say, you know what, I treat all my kids fairly. I treat all my kids nice. I don't make any distinction between them, but then you talk to the students, they say, no, she doesn't. She says stuff to kids that are quite dismissive. So part of what you need to learn is the work of racial microaggression by folks like Danny Solorzano, Chester Pierce, about how we communicate these hostile and derogatory and negative slights towards people, right? It's not this blatant kind of in-your-face racism that we see now. It's the slights, right, that folks are oftentimes unaware of. Child does well in your classroom, and you're surprised that the child has done well. Right? The child brings home her homework, and you're surprised that the child brought home the homework. Did somebody help you with the homework? Right? Child shows up in the AP or honors class, and you're thinking, are you in the right class or should you be someplace else? Right? These comments that we make that oftentimes are that are insults, right? And they cut across all social identities. It's not just racial. It can be also gendered. It can also be across sexual orientation lines. But part of what we have to also understand that intention does not equal impact. Okay? I want to stress that again. Intention does not equal impact, because I have folks who tell me, you know what, I may have said that, but you know, I wasn't trying to hurt that person. It wasn't my intent. It doesn't matter. The intent still has an impact that is resulting in some slight or some hurt on the part of the person who receives it, right? So we have to be mindful of these comments that we oftentimes are making, assuming that a child who has a Spanish surname must not speak English, right? Even adults get these microaggressions frequently, right? I get it all the time. The one that I cannot stand is after you give a talk somewhere, it's, Ma, you were just so articulate, right? What do you expect, right? Or when I'm out with my kids when they were younger, I would have folks come up and say, Ma, your kids are just so well behaved. What do you expect, right? So we got to fight these microaggressions because they play out in different ways. Let me show you one area they play out in. How much time I got, Tracy? I know I'm going to watch the clock. Oh, goodness, I'm going to take my time then. Okay, so now, so one of the areas where it plays itself out is that now we have the disparities in school discipline, right? I want us all to start looking at our school discipline data, okay? Because the school discipline data is telling us the story that we don't want to come to grips with, okay? And I go to district after district, state after state, and it's all the same, right? We have a, I don't know what it is. We have like this, some kind of racial contract that we just see black and brown kids as being more challenging than anybody else. And now it's happening earlier and earlier, because now we have suspension rates that we're capturing in preschool. Let me say that one more time, because I sometimes still have to say that a couple times just to make sure that folks get what I'm trying to get at. We have suspension rates in preschool. I don't know, I'm still trying to figure, I don't know what you do in preschool to get suspended, right? I mean, do you not sit crisscross applesauce the right way? I don't know what it is that you do, but it's happening. And it's happening early. And we have some clear racial ramifications associated with this, right? So look at this data from the U.S. Department of Education, which is oftentimes considered a more conservative source, right? Black and Latino boys are 20% of preschool enrollment, but they're 62% of all children, babies, who were suspended at least once. and 68% of students who are suspended more than once. That's a big problem, folks. You got 20% of a population, but yet they're almost 3/4 of the kids that we decide to put out, right? So part of what happens is that when we start, how old are you in preschool? What? 3, 4 years old? So if at 3 or 4 years old, you start to convey to children that they are a problem, we label you a problem, we treat you as a problem, we talk to you like you're a problem, what do you start to assume about yourself ultimately? I am a problem, and let me go ahead and act out this way because this is what you think about me. And not only do you think that about me, but the message we're also sending is that, guess what? All my peers also think I'm a problem as well. Thank you very much. So I need you to understand that part of what we're seeing is that these suspension rates happen early, and we know it takes one suspension, and a child's chance of graduating from high school is severely compromised. So we're talking about kids who are being already labeled before they even get to kindergarten, right? And so part of what we have to start asking ourselves is, why do we have such lower expectations for certain students? And part of where we have to have these conversations in our staffs, in our schools, in our districts, we have to start talking about race. I've written about this, I will continue to write about it. We don't like to talk about race because it makes us feel very what? Uncomfortable, right? We don't like to have this conversation. We can talk about poverty, we can talk about gender, we can talk about, disabilities, but that race thing is a little bit uncomfortable. Why do we not like to talk about race? Just me asking that question just got it silent, right? Yes, sir.
Perhaps it exposes some biases that we may have.
Come on now. We'd have to talk about biases that we all have. So this is the key. We all have them. We all have them in some way, because if you are raised in this country, you get inundated with messages every single day about certain populations, right? Part of what we know is if you look at this increasing amount of research now, it's looking at school referrals. What we're seeing is that school referrals that are happening disproportionately to black and brown children, it is not only white teachers who are doing it. Black teachers are doing it. Latino teachers are doing it. Asian teachers are doing it. Part of what the research shows is that teachers across the racial spectrum have lower expectations for black and brown children. So that's the whole idea. Part of what happens, I go to schools and I get these big racial debates. We have to talk about race, but one of the things that we do, which I have some issues with, we have these conversations that suggest that this is something that only white teachers do to kids of color, right? Now let's be clear, 85% of our classroom teachers are white people, right? And we need to talk about why that number is still sort of not changing, right? But let me be clear. Are there white teachers who are guilty of this? Absolutely there are. But by no means, and I say this unequivocally, and I want to be very clear on this, by no means do white teachers have the exclusive on doing wrong on behalf of children of color. I've been in enough schools, and the data bears this out, that teachers of color can also be equally as complicit in this as white teachers. I want you to understand that consciousness does not equate with skin color, right? Understand that this happens because people across the racial spectrum have bought into a narrative about what these children can do, right? We have little patience for what Malik does in his classroom. We have little patience for what Juanito does in his classroom, right? But then we oftentimes see children who are not black and brown engage in the same behavior, but yet we give them more tolerance. We give them more leniency. We're willing to give them more opportunities to correct the behavior. And that's what we have to start talking about. Why do we have such a different standard for one set of children compared to other? This number right here, and this is what I'm asking all schools to do now, look at your discipline data. I talk to principals all the time who tell me they can almost start to predict, like clockwork, when the day starts, when the students are going to start being sent to their office and who's going to send them there, right? Happening over and over again, right? I had one principal, I sat in her office. She said, okay, school started at 8:30. She said, I bet you by 8:45, I'll get at least one student from Mr. So-and-so's class. And we sat there and we talked. And about 10 minutes later, guess what? 2 students came in from Mr. So-and-so's class, right? We have to develop the skill set and the capacity to be able to help our teachers understand that getting rid of kids is not the answer. Remember what I said, oftentimes the behavior that we're seeing is oftentimes what? A plea for help, a plea for recognition, right? I oftentimes maintain that oftentimes the most disruptive students I had in my classroom when I taught them, and this is what I want my teacher candidates to keep in mind. The students who were my biggest challenges, when I met with them one-on-one, they were oftentimes very different individuals. Why do you think that is? they were getting attention, right? All the focus is on me. Someone's listening to me. Someone's giving me their ears uninterrupted, right? We have to listen more and talk less. My great-grandmother always says the reason why you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. So you listen twice as much as you talk. So part of the issue is, are we listening to what our children are telling us? Because if we listen more, we would understand some of the circumstances that they're dealing with, right? This is unacceptable. So then what happens, we have these data, but then we say, you know what? We didn't do anything wrong. These are the kids who just misbehaved. This is how microaggressions manifest itself, right? It's the mental health, the performance, and the quality of the social experiences begin to play out in different ways. We don't recommend kids for GATE. I was in a school district in Georgia just last week. Looked at their GATE data. They have 80% of the kids are black, but 10% of the kids in the gifted program are black. How does that happen? How does that happen? And no one's even raising the question. No one even says, let's take a closer look at this data. No one says, have you ever taken a look at the gifted and talented classes? All those kids there are white, despite the fact that the school is overwhelmingly black. That should be a red flag somehow, somewhere. But because I think we're unwilling to talk about it, we don't want to look at it. And it's not the obvious stuff, right? Chester Pierce says the subtle, cumulative, many assaults that is today's form of racism, right? How do we not have these kids recognized for their brilliance and their talents, right, and their intellect? Yet we're quick to see them as children we have to get rid of, we have to discipline, we have to suspend and expel, right? So part of what I don't want us to do is engage in this. This becomes our default. Because race is so difficult, because race is so uncomfortable, what do? We just don't talk about it. We tell folks, I don't see color, all I see are children. There's a bunch of baloney. I'm going to catch myself and be professional here, right? We see race every single day. It's all around us. And for us to act as if it doesn't exist, I think we're not being honest with ourselves. We're not being honest to our children that we're serving. We're not being honest with our families. We need to recognize it. We need to embrace it. We need to talk about it. We need to discuss it. And we need to honor it and celebrate it. That's one of our so-called strengths as a nation. But yet, we get in like circles, we talk about it all the time, but in mixed circles, we don't like to talk about it. And I'm always intrigued by even the way folks describe people, right? You say, I was talking to this lady today. Which lady were you talking to? Well, she had on some gray slacks, and she had on some black shoes. Like, no, who was that? Well, she also had on like an orange and pinkish scarf, right? We'll describe everything about the person. Everything about the person. No, who else? Who are you talking about? Well, she also had like a pinky ring on, and she has, we pick up on all these little minute details about a person other than to say, oh, you're talking about the white lady. Yeah, the white lady there, right? Why don't we want to say that? Right? We're afraid to even say white, black, Asian American, Latino. I don't know what that comes from, because we then have to think about our bias. We have to think about, here's the big issue we don't want to deal with. Having the conversation about race forces us to start talking about privilege. And we don't want to talk about privilege, because privilege is so much a part of what we don't stress in this society. We love to talk about what? Merit. Everybody gets to where they get based on what? Hard work, sacrifice, dedication, and discipline. Because you have what? What did Duckworth tell us that you had? Grit. We love that narrative. We get taught that narrative at an early age, right? Pull yourself up by the what? Yeah, you all got that. Put your nose to the what? I don't even know what a grindstone is, but I remember hearing that at an early age, right? I put my nose to something I don't know what to have, but those statements assume a lot. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps assumes that I have boots. It assumes that if I do have boots, it assumes that they have straps. Let's go one step further. It assumes I have feet, right? So part of why race is difficult is because we don't like to talk about privilege, because part of what we don't like to acknowledge is that you got to where you got because you had help, right? You accomplished what you did because you had advantage that I didn't have, and we're at the same place. And you feel bad because guess what? If you had help and I didn't, what does that say about you? Yeesh, then it really gets real difficult, right? So part of what I want us to start doing in our schools and in our classrooms, in our districts, is having these conversations about race and racial privilege and white privilege in particular, right? What folks have to understand, I talk to a lot of my white colleagues, is that, look, just the mere fact that you have white skin, it means something in this society. People assume that you know more. People assume that you work harder. People assume that you have all the gifts and talents to be successful. They're just based on your phenotype alone that folks of color don't get that benefit of the doubt, right? Talk to your children of color about what they see and what they experience every single day, and they'll tell you what their reality is like. My oldest son always has this little experiment. I keep telling him to stop. He said, Dad, we're going to go in the store, right? And we're going to go in the store. I'm going to just walk in circles. And I'm going to walk in circles. And I know that somebody is going to end up doing what? And they oftentimes do. Just follow him in circles, right? And then one time he got bold. He said he just walked. I just watched him. He just walked in circles. And the lady just kind of, she kind of acted like she was straightening stuff up. But she was kind of following. Wherever he went, she went. And then he said, are you following me? And she like stopped in her tracks. Oh, no. I'm just straightening the shelves. He's like, well, I've walked around this store 3 times. And you've been at every point of the term I've been to, right? And these are the kind of experiences that folks of color oftentimes talk about. What we experience every single day that oftentimes if you're white, you don't have to encounter. Courage has got to be around. How do we talk about what it means to be white, right? And folks oftentimes tell me, my white colleagues and my white friends say, you know what, I never thought about that. And that's the point, that you never have to think about it, right? If someone questions whether or not you qualify for the job, you don't have to think about, was it because of my race? Oftentimes folks of color have to think, wow, I did well on that test. Was it because I'm black or because I'm Latino or because I'm Asian? It may not be the case, but the question crosses our mind. And that's what we oftentimes have to carry. To this day, I tell folks, look, I got all the degrees they can come with. I am driving down the street, and if a police car is behind me, my heart starts to race. And my white friends say, well, why? Do you have your registration and license and proof of insurance? I say, yes, but it still doesn't matter, because folks who look like me oftentimes have all those things, and they've not lived to tell about it, right? We have to have these conversations about what white privilege means and what this entitlement oftentimes affords certain people that it doesn't afford to others. Just like we need to have the same kind of conversation when it comes to gender and male privilege, right? So oftentimes I don't recognize my own privileges because I'm a male. We live in a patriarchal society that tells men that just by the mere fact that you're born biologically male, that we assume that you know more. We assume that you work harder. We assume that you make more money. You can be dumb as a doorknob, but we just assume because you're male, you walk in that you know more, right? Me and my wife would have this conversation. We used to have this debate for years about whether or not men could be feminists. I would tell her, yes, man could be feminist. Men, if you're about eradicating systems of oppression against women, you can be a feminist. She said, no, you can't be a feminist because you don't know what it's like to walk in the shoes of a woman every single day. So we'd have this back and forth. And so one day, my male privilege came to fruition in ways that I didn't know, because that's what privilege does. It blinds you from realities that you can't quite understand. So my wife asked me, she said, okay, let me ask you a question. She said, when you leave work and you are going to your car, because there's a big parking lot next to my building where I work, and it's an underground garage. She said, when you are walking to your car in an underground garage, what are you thinking about? I said, what are you talking about? She said, when you're going to your car, what are you thinking about? I said, I'm thinking about getting in my car. She said, okay, what else are you thinking about? I said, I think about what music I'm going to listen to while I'm in my car. I said, I'm not knowing where this is going, but this is what privilege does. You think you know stuff that you don't know. She said, okay, good, let's keep going. She said, what else are you thinking about when you're walking to that car? I said, I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat when I get home because I'm hungry. Okay, what else? Keep going. I'm thinking about, where are you going? I'm thinking about finding the car, getting the car, hope there's no traffic on the road. She said, that's why you can't be a feminist. Now, what do you mean? She said, because see, what men don't have to think about when they're walking to their cars in that underground parking garage at night when it's dark, what men don't think about, and I see a lot of the women here shaking their heads, that women have to think about what? Safety. She said, see, when I'm walking in that garage, food is not on my mind, music is not on my mind, traffic is not on my mind. She said, I got my key like this out, I got my hand on my pepper spray. I'm ready for somebody to even think about approaching me, right? Yeah, never crossed my mind because men don't have to think about those kinds of things, right? She said, I'm thinking about sexual assault. I'm thinking about rape. She said, that's what most women think about when they're in those kind of underground parking structures. She said, and the worst thing is, she said, you're walking in that underground garage and you can't find your car. Yeah. And you're like, okay, wait a minute. All of them are like, oh, yeah, that's happened before, right? Stuff men don't think about. We get lost all the time in those garages, but we don't worry about our safety, right? So she says that you're in that garage and you're lost, and then all of a sudden you hear like a noise. And you hear the noise, and you don't know whether you should stop to see what the noise is. Do you walk faster? Do you run? Do you holler? All these are things I never had to think about before. So I felt bad after. I was like, okay, now I got to check my privilege, right? So I told my wife, I said, so the next time I see a lady who looks lost in the underground structure, should I approach her and ask her for, she's like, no, you don't want to do that, right? You will get stabbed and pepper sprayed all at the same time. Just mind your business, right? But I use that example to say that there are things that she described in that scenario alone that just opened my eyes, and I had no idea that women have to think about all those things just to walk to a car, right? And I use that as an example for why we have to talk about our sort of male privilege and how patriarchy shapes the way we see the world. Same thing when it comes to race, right? So when it comes to issues of gender, men need to stop talking and listen to women describe what it means to be woman, right? Men can't be the ones who have all the answers for what affects women. Men can't be the ones who say that, you know what, gender bias does not exist. And I know a lot of men who do just that thing. Well, how do you know? You're not a woman. You wouldn't experience it firsthand anyway. So my thing is when it comes to gender issues, let the folks who are the ones who experience it and live it, let them be the ones who educate and enlighten all of us. Same thing when it comes to race, okay? We can't have white people who are always telling us how racism no longer exists. How would you know if you're not receiving it? Listen to what folks of color are telling you. Listen to what children of color are telling you. Listen to what parents of color are telling you. One of the sessions I want to see is this whole white teacher, black mama thing, right? After lunch, right? We need to listen to what people are experiencing and feeling because that oftentimes can help to enlighten us about how we can better be allies for them in this world. Does that make sense to folks? I got way off topic on that one. Okay, so anyway. So part of what we have to understand is that when we see children who are in trauma, let me come back to trauma, is that we typically see 3 types of behavior according to experts in the field. People who are in trauma oftentimes flight, fight, or freeze. Flight, fight, or freeze. Because trauma does so much to the cognitive and to the emotional sort of makeup of who we are. Oftentimes we have people who will just flight. Let's start with flight. Sometimes flight, we see more kids who just get up out the class, and what do? They run, they just leave. Because sometimes the trigger has been activated, they don't know how to respond to that trigger, I just need to get out of here, right? Or sometimes kids will shut down, daydream, avoid others, just become disengaged, right? I'm just gonna just check out here because that's my way of flying away from whatever is this traumatic situation right here, okay? For some of our students, it's fight, because fight is about survival. Fight is about doing what I have to do to protect myself, right? I see a lot of our schools, again, fighting is one of the biggest issues we have. I was at a middle school recently, and the principal, I asked him, I said, what's the biggest challenge that you have at your school? He says, fighting. He said, it's my girls who are fighting. I was like, wow. He said, I have this group at my school that is just the bane of my whole existence. He said, they are called the BABs. Like BABs. I see some of you shaking your head. I was in the dark. I had no idea what he was talking about, who the BABs were. I said, I'm clue. I'm like, Babs? What is the Babs? He's like, no. He said, they're called the badass bitches. It's a group of girls. And I guess they must have a mission statement or a motto or something. Really, he said their goal is to find other girls who think they are cute or that they think they are cute and to beat them up. That's what they do. He said, so all the issues I have with the BABs is around this violence girl on girl. He said, because part of this issue, again, this is all trauma again, right? I see something I don't like. I see something that reminds me of a traumatic situation. So therefore, I do what? I fight. So understand that some of your children who are fighting, right? We have to try to understand root causes of the behavior. What is generating why we see the behavior being the way it is. Then for some kids, it's freeze, right? It's just numbing. It's just refusing to participate, right? I'm just going to just check out. I just can't respond. I'm not going to act. I'm not going to speak. I'm not going to think because I'm just trying to find a way. If I can make myself invisible, I would, because something has happened, something that is said, something that is done that activates the trigger of the trauma all over again. Sometimes you've seen kids, you just walk by them, and they kind of flinch. They kind of cower up because oftentimes that may trigger something that may have happened to them before. So you need to understand that when you have students who flight, who exhibit fight or freeze, that is not a kid who does not care. That is a kid who might be in traumatic stress, and you've got to understand that. It makes sense to folks? So what do we need to do? Here's some resources. We have to become informed, folks, plain and simple. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, you can take this website. It is an amazing website that has all types of resources Not only does it offer resources, but it offers strategies. It offers how-tos. It offers different types of intervention. It helps you to identify ways in which you can better support students who are in trauma. Same thing for the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. Phenomenal website that I have all my pre-service teachers read, and we discuss this now because, again, part of what we're seeing is that we're not doing an adequate job. I hate to say this, I'm speaking generally, we're not doing an adequate job in teacher preparation, helping our teachers understand trauma. We're just not. We don't talk about it. Or if we do, it's very surface level, and it's going to be, unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges that a lot of our beginning teachers have. So these are just a few resources. There's also, I don't think I have this up here, there's a wonderful little book by Susan Craig, C-R-A-I-G, Susan Craig, that I'm going to make required reading for all my teacher candidates. It's about trauma-informed instruction or something. A little small little purple book, but it's a wonderful resource that I think we should all be reading, okay? So I say all that to say, how do we change this in my brief time I have left? Teachers matter, plain and simple, right? And I need you to understand what you do makes a difference. And we know over and over again that over 20 plus years that the single most important factor in changing student outcomes has been what? Been who? The teacher. So despite all the trauma, despite all the issues that we talked about, despite the fact that we don't talk about race, you make a difference. You can help to disrupt that. Part of what we know is that teachers, when they are prepared adequately, look, teacher preparation matters. You have high quality teacher education like you're getting here, right, in the IUE, you begin to overcome some of the impacts of trauma, impacts of poverty, if you are equipped and skilled and knowledgeable, right? Teachers who know their content but also know how to connect to students, who build relationships, who are culturally competent, make a difference. You begin to change the impacts on reading, change the impacts on math, even for kids who are growing up in poverty, right? I'm sure I have a number of teachers who are in this classroom, who are in this room right now, leaders who are making a big impact on children despite all the data that tells you these kids should not perform well, despite all the narratives that says these kids cannot accomplish, because guess what? Teachers can make a difference. So the question is, what is it that these teachers do? I say that before I get into it because part of what we know is that oftentimes education school alumni overwhelmingly say that they feel like their teacher preparation programs do not adequately prepare them for the work of schools. That is like a shot to us in teacher education, Dr. Nix. We got to do better. So then what happens, are any principals in the house today? You all know this, right? So I hear principals say oftentimes they have to retrain the teachers once they come to the schools because schools of education don't do an adequate job. I mean, if teaching in K-12 schools is about reciting theory, well, I mean, our candidates would be amazing, right? Our candidates can tell you theory frontwards and backwards. We know about stages of operational development, what Piaget said, what Vygotsky said. We know that like the back of our hands, but we couldn't tell you how to have a 5-minute conversation with a student. So how do we begin to do this? This is about relationship building. It's about high leverage practices, right? It's about knowing your students in their social cultural realities. And I was teaching, my first year principal made it required for all teachers to do home visits. Home visits. I think she made up something. She said, as a district mandate, you got to go visit all the students' homes. Like, we didn't know, so we did it. We went and knocked on doors and talked to mothers and grandmothers and fathers and uncles, and we got to know our students, who they were being raised by, what was happening, who was important in their lives, just to see the routes they oftentimes walked to get from home to school, or the bus route they had to take, just to know what our kids see, feel, and hear every single day. That matters, right? You got to understand trauma. You got to build trust. Again, part of what you have to understand, one of the biggest things I used to do with my students, I used to say, look, once a week, I'm going to pick 2 students to have lunch with Mr. Howard. That changed the entire dynamic with some of my students, because that's relationship building. Go to an extracurricular event or activity. You show up at a kid's soccer game on a Saturday or a football game on a Saturday morning, they will be blown away by the fact that you took time out of your schedule to come to my event. How many times see it? What happens, our kids think that we eat, live, and sleep in the school building. They think we have no lives outside of that room, right? You ever see your kids like in a grocery store, they lose their mind. What are you doing here, right? They just think that you're supposed to be in that classroom. Connect with your kids. Listen without judgment, right? This is one of the big things we cannot do. Listen, but don't then castigate parents. Listen, but don't castigate home, right? I believe parents are trying the best that they can do, but we do better when we know better, right? And sometimes kids don't want to tell you about their home life because they think that you might then think less of them or less of their parents and whoever's raising them. So you gotta listen without judgment, right? You gotta see teaching and learning is reciprocal. I oftentimes say share as much with your students about you as you want them to share about themselves, right? Everybody in this room has had to deal with some kind of adversity. Everybody. Everybody here has had some kind of setback. Talk about that. Our students need to hear it, that you know what, you're not the only one who's had to deal with these kinds of challenges. Talk about a loss that you had in your life. Talk about a parent who may not have been there. Talk about when your parents divorced. Talk about when you lost a grandparent. They need to understand that this is what happens in life, but you can bounce back from that, okay? Always understand that with trauma, there's gonna be some opposition. Let me tell my teacher candidates, there's gonna be some times that that students tell you, no, I'm not doing it. And you will break down like, oh my gosh, she said no. Well, guess what? You gotta keep on being persistent, right? Understand, kids resist, that's what they do. But just because they resist, it does not mean that you give up. Does not mean that you say that they don't care. You got to understand that, look, I hate to say this, folks, my seasoned teachers can tell you this. If you're going to do this work, you got to have some thick skin. Very thick skin. Because you're going to get called all kind of names. You will have students who will cuss you out. I'm just saying, trauma manifests itself in different ways. So you got to understand that these issues around cultural competence are important, right? There are different things that we have to understand that are culturally mediated, right? Culturally mediated. Let me give you a brief example before I get ready to close it, because this is important. We have a rites of passage program we used to run in Los Angeles. We work with young men. And I got a call from the school saying that one of our young men had been arrested. And someone needed to come to the school because they couldn't find his parent. So I got to the school, this young man named Marcus, who had been having our challenge with. Marcus was in the 6th grade, like 13 years old, big kid, right? They said Marcus assaulted a teacher. So he's sitting there in the front of the school in handcuffs. Marcus is a challenging kid, but I know Marcus would never hurt a flea, let alone assault a teacher. So I asked, the police officer at the set, can you get him out the car? Can you take the handcuffs off? Can I at least talk to him to find out what happened? So they let him out the car and took the handcuffs. I said, Marcus, what happened? And they said, you assaulted a teacher. What did you do? And so he said, well, Mr. Howard, he said, I was wrong because I was in the class and I was talking. And they sent me out of, I forget her name, Miss whatever her name was, Miss Jones, Miss Smith, sent me out of the class. He said, I was messing up, I wasn't working. And so she sent me out the class. I said, okay. I said, so what happened next? He said, she told me to stand outside the door until she can come talk to me. He said, so I was waiting for her. So she came out and she came and she started talking to me. He said, and she got in my face. He said, and she started pointing her finger. And she pointed her finger like real close to my nose. He said, and I told her, get your finger out of my face. He said, and she didn't do it. He said, I told her a second time, get your finger out of my face. He said, she didn't do it. He said, Mr. Howard, I moved to the side and got away from her. He said, when I moved to the side, she moved with me. And she still kept her finger in my face, telling me how my behavior was unacceptable. So I'm listening to this and I'm like, okay, I kind of know where this is going now, right? He said, Mr. Howard, he said, I moved the third time. He said, I just kind of walked away. He said, every time I walked away, he said, she moved right in front of me. He said, she got real close that her finger was almost about to touch me. And when she was talking, she like accidentally spat on me. Now, let's stop right there. A lot of folks are shaking their head because in some circles, some cultural spaces, you pointing your finger, just pointing your finger at me can be considered what? Yeah, threatening, disrespectful. And that you can do that from 10 feet away. But the closer you get, for some people, the more of a threat and the more disrespectful that can be. And then to add injury to insult, the fact that I think that inadvertently as she's talking to him, as she's speaking, she accidentally spits in his face. So he said, when that happened, he said, I grabbed her hand, I pushed it out my face, and I pushed her out the way, and I walked away. Now, I told Marcus, you're wrong as two left shoes, because you should never put your hand on a teacher, ever, right? But in that situation, I hate to say it, folks, I kind of understood what pushed him to that point, right? Because what happened in that situation was he told her to get the finger out of his face. He said 3 times. He stepped aside twice to get out of her space, yet she still insisted on doing this. Some just cultural norms you have to understand. Children tell you not to do something, it might make sense not to do it, folks, okay? So he was assaulted because of the fact he grabbed her hand and he pushed her, and she filed charges against the young man, right? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that happens. We talk about the school to prison pipeline situation, right? We get more of our young kids who oftentimes find themselves on this track because oftentimes it's not real just aberrant behavior. It's just a disconnect between cultural norms. There's certain things you don't do, certain things you don't say. If a child comes in and says, look, my name is Theodore. Nobody calls me Theodore other than my mother. Please don't call me Theodore in the class. Guess what you need to do? Not call him Theodore, right? If he says, call me TJ, you need to call him what? TJ, right? Kids will tell you what these norms are oftentimes. The question is, are we willing to listen to them, right? This is what cultural competence is all about. So part of what we have to understand, look, relationships matter. We had this big project we did with young men, black and brown young men, about sort of the ways in which they made sort of these amazing outcomes. These are all college-going young men who did. They said, look, it was about teachers who invested, teachers who listened, teachers who cared, teachers who opened up their classrooms for a place for me to come and talk, for a place for me to come and put my head down, for me to come and just vent, right? This is not rocket science. It's just teachers making themselves available for young people who are going through circumstances that they shouldn't have to go through, right? Relationships, teachers need to humanize themselves. These are all the things that the kids told us. These young men said, look, teachers that relate to real life situations, right? This is what matters. We appreciate, this is one young man said, we appreciate the teachers that don't trip off little things. You know, if somebody's not working right now, it's for a reason. Understand that. He got drama going on at the house maybe. Come talk to him and show him that you're concerned a little bit, right? Talking, listening, learning. This is what this is all about, right? So we need to start doing micro-affirming, right? I talked about microaggression. I want us to start moving towards micro-affirming. What is micro-affirming? These are small acts which are oftentimes ephemeral and hard to see, but they communicate to students that I believe in you, right? Little things, opening doors to provide opportunity, giving credit to others, showing the ropes, right? Helping students to navigate the process of how they can be successful, mentoring others, saying affirming things is a micro-affirmation. Paying compliments is a micro-affirmation, right? Children just want to be seen, right? I see you got a new haircut. I love your haircut. I see you got new shoes. I love those shoes. I see you got new earrings on. Just little small micro-affirmations go a long way to help students feel better about themselves. We know how we feel when we get compliments, right? Somebody ever tell you, well, you look like you lost some weight. You haven't tried step the first to lose weight, right? But you feel good about yourself, right? You walk around like you done all kind of exercise. No, you haven't done jack, right? But you like the fact that somebody made a comment or statement to you about you being in a better place. If we love that as adults, you don't think our kids need these affirmations? They do, right? So what else? We're talking about micro-affirmations, small acts that can have a big impact on individual success. If I went around this room right now and asked you to tell me who your favorite teachers were, you would probably tell me teachers who believed in you, teachers who cared about you, teachers who built up your confidence. You wouldn't say that teacher really helped me understand how to break down the Pythagorean theorem. It's not that kind of stuff. How do I feel, right? It's micro-affirmation that involves simply more than being nice. It's like used as an intentional way to see strengths-based. The fact that you show up in my class every single day matters. I go to middle schools, I go to high schools. There's some students who are there the entire day, but they only show up to one class because there's one teacher that they feel like who understands them. Why does a child come for one class, one period? Because something is happening in that classroom, okay? So I want to close on this because I'm big on this. Part of what I want us to do, and I got you, Dr. Nix, I'm going to close in 2 minutes, okay? All right, so listen, we got to move away from this sympathetic stuff, right? I see lots of teachers who see all this stuff we talk about, they feel sorry for students. If you're a sympathetic, you feel sorry for students. Once you feel sorry for students, what do? You lower expectations. You don't help anybody by lowering expectations for students. Once you lower expectations for students, you don't challenge them. You don't challenge them, you're saying, I am complicit in your failure. Plain and simple. If you don't challenge them, you then subscribe to what Martin Haberman calls his pedagogy of poverty, low-level work, busy work, just to keep students from not getting in your hair, right? Deficit-based thinking. I want us to move away from this deficit-based sympathetic stuff. We got to be more empathetic. Empathetic teachers do what? They listen to and learn from students. Try to put yourself in the shoes of your students and understand what makes them tick. So you may not get that homework. You may not have done that homework last night because you had a difficult situation, but guess what? Today you're going to come to my classroom at lunch or at recess and you're going to get it done because we still believe in accountability, right? We also have to stress that student culture and experiences matter. Hold students accountable to rigor. Even when you remediate, you can still remediate with rigor, depth, and complexity, right? And you also have to recognize that you still can expect and demand excellence. And I also say this, when you are empathetic, you teach like lives depend on it. Do you know why? Because they do. Plain and simple, right? So look, real recognizes real. And your students will recognize whether or not you are on board or not. Mr. Freeman will tell you this, right? This is not bound by your skin color, your gender, your age, your size. This is about what's in your head and your heart. Do you believe in other people's children with the same intensity and effort that you would expect someone to believe in your own children? If you are giving other people's children something less than that, then you should not be doing this work, folks. Plain and simple, okay? Look, plain and simple. These are things we can say. I want to support you. I believe in your potential. I understand your needs. So look, Maya Angelou said this, and I'll close it on this. I promise. She said, I've learned that people forget what you said. People forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Let's make our students feel like they're the most important people in the world. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.